second case keynote. My name is Adrian Moss. I am from Naver Labs Europe. And today is my pleasure to introduce the speaker of the keynote, Thomas Baudel. Thomas Baudel is a research director at IBM France R&D Lab, and also a member of the board of the University Paris-Saclay doctoral school, where he teaches about research and computer ethics. He's also involved in several human-computer interaction initiatives. These days, he is particularly interested in information ethics, AI ethics, and design ethics, and in particular, how they can be addressed with technical solutions and how they connect to software design, and in particular to decision engineering, which is a topic for today. These topics are extremely relevant in today's societal context, as you can probably imagine. So I'm sure you'll find this presentation particularly interesting. Just before we start, a reminder of a few good practices when attending a live talk. So as you know, it's always good to turn off email and phones to avoid any distractions. And for questions, please use the Q&A functionality of Zoom or the chat window to write a question. Then I will then ask the speaker. Otherwise, if you would like to ask the question directly to the speaker at the end, please raise your hand. There is a function for raising your hand, and I will try to pass you the microphone so that you can ask the question directly. And for some people, it's also possible that are joining us via Hova, it's also possible to ask the question in the chat or the session Q&A on the web interface or the Hova interface. So with that, Thomas, I let you take the stage, and I hope you all enjoy this great presentation.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Thank you for the conference chairs to organize very courageously this event, moving it from the physical world to the infosphere. I find this initiative very exciting, and I'm very excited to be able to enjoy presenting our current work with people from everywhere, because it's one of the great things about these online events is that we have people from almost everywhere. And I think it's a great opportunity to show how the infosphere or the digital world is transforming our lives. In this challenging time, transforming it perhaps not for the best, but at least for a little bit better than it could have been. In this keynote, I wanted to introduce you to a journey that I took from decision engineering, from being a researcher who works on BPM product, on variety of products that are presented in the conference, and how did it come that my main research activity these days become what I call information ethics, and I'm not alone to call it that way, through just a journey. I've seen a few papers at this conference, and I must say I'm not part of the community, even though we share a lot in common. I participate what we call ourselves the France Lab, but we call ourselves also the Decision Engineering Labs, because we are doing a lot of products that are used by some of the biggest organizations in the world to streamline their processes, to organize them. And even though many of you may already know about the way I present decision engineering, I will first start to state my viewpoint within the world of BPM, decision automation, robotic process automation, and so that we can build a shared common understanding. Next, because it's exciting and the sort of things that we present, I wanted to show you where are we going, what is the future direction which we think are important for decision engineering to take. And in this process, we will see new issues that emerge. And when we tackle these issues, we will realize, hey, this is not what I learned at engineering school. I haven't learned how to tackle this problem. And so that will let me introduce what I call information ethics, not as some abstract philosophical discussion, but as really something that engineers should appropriate because they encounter issues that are relevant in their everyday world, and that's work, and that's how this journey ended up placing me at University Paris-Saclay, actually doing the course because I want doctoral students to be able to address the problem that I identified. So let's zoom back. Decision engineering, what is this? I'm sure most of you, maybe not all of you, know about the notion that a company has lots of very complex processes, and that it's important for this company to stay on top of these very complex processes. Here I show you the example of a hiring process. Basically, say I want to hire even an intern, so it should be a fairly simple thing to do, just hiring an intern. First, I will ask my manager, do I have the budget to do so? My manager will ask finance if they have the budget, finance grant and authorization. Then I will go to HR and I will say, okay, I have the agreement to hire. HR will usually ask other kind of agreements, but I know that ultimately they will publish a job offer and pre-screen some application and then me. So the process turns back to me. I interview candidates and they say I select someone, HR prepare contracts, and in doing so, they will involve other departments that will perform various compliance checks. There is a procurement service that will assign a machine to the intern. There's some variety. HR takes back to welcome and do some basic training. And finally, the job can start. It can take a few months to do that. And it's actually very, very complex. And also it can derail at various places. So for you, for many of you, it's not really new, but clearly in this kind of process, there's part of the job that needs to be done by human and part of the job that can be automated. And we have example of this everywhere, and this is a sort of product that or technician issue that we address in our product, and that makes the living of a lab of 300 persons. So I can, even though I cannot cite names, you can imagine that 300 engineers must generate a lot of revenue to be able to sustain themselves. Let's move up a little bit abstract and return to a fairly old picture, but I think that it translates the global vision of what we're trying to achieve from an economic and a social standpoint. If I was to summarize in just one catchy sentence, what is decision engineering? I would say from a scientific standpoint, it is about, can we program an enterprise like we program a robot? And what you see in this pyramid is the various stages that at the lab over the past 20 years, we are trying to progress towards. So in the beginning, you have IT, you have big COBOL programs that, and you have a manager when they want some change in the process to occur, they have to tell an analyst who will study the things that have to be changed. The analyst will will write a specification, and the specification will get transmitted into the information system, and it will slowly move up. With business rules or with BPM, what we are doing is that we are trying to place to shortcut some of those paths and place the management in charge in the capability of defining themselves some local change that they want to do. They can either perform some local process change or some decision rules. So for instance, if a country all of a sudden has some issues and we don't want to sell in this country, the manager or the legal analyst who is made aware of a change of a regulation can introduce themselves. If the customer is from such and such country, perhaps we should notify them that we have to stop business for legal reasons with them. And then as we move up, we can envision the dream. Of course, it's never fully completed, but of a company wherein information flows are programmed by the appropriate levels of management rather than by human intermediates who will sometimes not completely transcribe the perception of what should the information flows actually be. Because at each step, when you introduce some human in the loop, as most of you know, it somewhat changes a little bit the requirement. So just to make you a brief overview of the type of products that we're doing, we are doing business rules. The idea is to formalize the decision logic, the deductive part of the information flows of the enterprise with a very simple rule that is provided. We have business process management, which is what I just showed you. And we have complex event processing, which is a notion that some external events they are kind of the input-output of the robot. If a customer places an order, then it has to trigger a process. And complex event processing is trying to detect from outside world events what sort of process in the business activity should be triggered. I will move on. Well, this is a big picture. This is the intent. This is a vision that step by step, release after release, we are progressing towards. Now, in practice, part of this vision is successfully implemented. Other parts need new direction. And what do we observe? And I've seen some other papers in this conference. Many people in the audience are probably aware of the difficulties that I'm showing. Well, for a computer scientist, processes and decisions are extremely simple. They do not require intensive resource computations. So we typically compare to back propagation in a neural network or ray tracing in computer graphics. Everything that we have to do and describe is very simple. What makes the job fairly difficult, I think, well, what we know is difficult is maintenance and oversight of those processes. We know that sometimes these processes are bypassed by workers who find them inconvenient and resort to person-to-person interaction, which is also sometimes a good thing, to overcome some difficulties. And the reason, perhaps fundamental reason I think this happens is that the knowledge about the process must remain relatively complete, but the knowledge about this process is not as pervasive as the process themselves that orchestrates the enterprise. That is to say, we have chains of people who were traversed or linked by these processes, and each individual will tend to be able to make their job more efficiently, will tend to ignore what is going outside and or not be aware of what is going outside. And yet this knowledge still must remain pervasive. So what this leads is fairly well-known shortcomings in general. So what is difficult is the fragmentation of tasks that makes it difficult to for knowledge workers to actually be aware of their surrounding, which they can usually in human-to-human interaction. It makes it difficult to handle special cases, and in general, the decision process loses context. these are fairly well-known fairly well-known discussed, and there are papers at conferences such as this one that discuss these problems. But I think that this kind of formulation is more a business-oriented formulation, but it's important to understand that's how we explain where we're going. So in order to do that, I'm going to show you a few of those, the direction that we take, and a few projects. So where are we going as a research lab and a development lab to provide or to overcome these shortcomings for our customers? We have a big initiative about decision modeling notation, and I've seen some papers in this conference that, and other technologies that in general we try to align tools, the software tool that we're doing, to common high-level modeling techniques. So it's not so easy because very often the modeling techniques are made to do some top-down approach of process modeling. The top-level manager will use decision modeling notation to describe what they want from a high-level standpoint. And then they will refine slowly. But the tools cannot work if you don't go to the bottom of the decision, of how the decision is performed. And so the difficulties in bridging the gap of the engineer who will tend, or the implementer will tend to go by force of need from a top to bottom approach, from a bottom to top approach, and the business analyst will necessarily go from a top to bottom approach. And this is, well, these tools are very promising, but this is the difficulty, the conceptual difficulty in implementing them. Another approach is very different. In the project called Pulsar, what we try to do instead is put the user back in control of the process by allowing local customization and sharing of those local customization, and in the hopeful, with the hope that these local customizations can make some higher level organizational change emerge from what the users do, the users of the process do, rather than from a top-down decision of management to reorganize the process. Finally, and this is perhaps the idea is to augment the decision maker with artificial memory and inference. So the idea is that because we have lots of process instances that run through our business processes and decisions that are made, and that in general the same causes tend to produce the same effects, perhaps if we use the memory that is accumulated and use it appropriately to help the user make better decisions, we will improve in general the decision engineering products that we're developing. No, these are projects. These are not things that we have completely implemented yet. I'm sorry, this slide I will go very fast. So basically the notion of Pulsar is to introduce the notion of skills into a process management tool. And really a skills for those who program is very equivalent to a macro in a programming language. Except we call them with a vocabulary that it's much closer to the language of the business analyst who design processes. And the notion is that this macro can be shared by a variety of users on simile App Store. It's exactly the paradigm of the App Store, but it's specialized for the enterprise. And that with these app stores, we will be able to have users pick the kind of macros that others have implemented, and therefore build a common shared understanding of the process and customization of the process that will pervade through the whole process and not just be used by isolated processes. This is something we have implemented, and now we have to generate the attractiveness so that users can appropriate themselves. What's kind of interesting is that we are putting users back in charge of how they want to work, and this is in alignment with modern engineering practices. So we have good hopes. The next thing that is of interest and where I want to lead you to is something that is very easy to implement technically. And the idea is that in many cases, you have to rely on a human decision to perform a decision. So here, this is an example. Well, this is a streamlined example of a medical insurance claim in a medical insurance company. So basically, each claim has to be reviewed by a human. They have to inspect the document, the requirements, perhaps to read a note that someone has left, and decide whether or not this claim should be refunded by the insurance company. What we did, which was fairly easy technically, is that we just implemented machine learning algorithms based on past histories, whether the present claim should be approved or not. Because as you see, perhaps at the end, the only tasks the knowledge worker has to do is to review the claim and click a button. And here, we use a variety of tools. We allow our process implementers to embed this feature and just provide this feedback. And our hope is that because it doesn't seem to entail, it seems only positive information that we provide, the user can do with or without this information. Well, it can only be good. Well, as all engineers, when we try to implement a new feature or when we propose something, we ask ourselves some questions and we try to assess whether these questions are good. So the first thing, is this information useful? The answer is it's useful only in specific cases. It's not useful in general. That's predictable. Next, we want our customers, well, if we provide a new feature, we want our customers to purchase it. So we want to have some qualitative data about whether or not the users make better decisions when they are provided with this augmented memory about what happened in the past and appropriate use of the past. And so we can think of A/B testing. We can think of a variety of ways to answer this question. We have technological means to assess that. Next, what is the quantitative impact? If we want to sell a feature, we want to be able to say, okay, thanks to our new feature, medical doctors were assessing cancer patient treatment are able to make 80 diagnostic decision per day instead of the usual 20 they used to do. That's very interesting, but you can also immediately see that it is kind of dangerous. So we have a few other technical questions, but ultimately what emerges as a question is, okay, if the system is useful, what does it do with the accountability of the persons that use it? What becomes, are they still in charge? And do we not distort the notion of responsibility? And there, with the engineers, within the engineers, we have lots of very bizarre questions that emerge, like responsibility, question of explainability, questions of bias. So we know about statistical bias, algorithmic bias, but here we may also have cognitive biases. We have questions of technology appropriations. If various users appropriate themselves the tools differently, what will happen? Will the decisions stay uniform? And we have tools in HEIs, in behavioral economics, in social psychology to address part of those questions. The problem is that we are mere engineers. We just want to deliver cool features. Why do these questions befall upon us? We are not equipped with dealing with these questions. Our workflow usually is to study a system, create a model for this system, gather data about the system to validate or refute the model, derive a theory and leverage a theory to improve the system or create something new. We use deduction, we use induction, we sometimes use abduction. But ethicists and by the way, lawyers leverage dialectics, which is something radically different. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Here, some kind of typical ethical dilemma that have to be resolved. So for instance, you have the statement, free speech must be allowed on online platform. I'm sure everybody will agree with this statement. Everybody will also agree with the second statement, with that content that involve libel, privacy invention, or fake news should be removed on an online platform. Everybody, I think, more or less agrees with this statement in its full generality. I've given some other example. The problem is that statements A and statement B are self-contradicting. They contradict each other. Also, we have diverging value systems. We have some people who are utilitarian. They value the notion of a global utility function of society. And their goal is to maximize this utility function. There are other people who say, no, what matters is the free expression of free will. And even if it does not improve the global well-being, what matters is that people are still responsible for their own choices. You have other values who value communitarism, and I pointed to a link on very interesting stuff, on a set of talks on these aspects. So these things open up a new world of questioning for engineers. And what is interesting is that it's in our everyday work that we realize that we are not equipped to deal with that. And you can see here, there are lots of initiatives, and many, perhaps most of these initiatives are industry initiated. In AI ethics, the buzzword is coming up, people are discussing, there are frameworks that are being drawn, and it catches you as a professional, it catches you. Many people claim that this is ethics washing, that we are not doing this because we want, we are doing this as damage control or as a liability protection. I would argue that it's not true. We are doing this because we are facing problems that just we are bumping into problem, and we have to agree on how we address them. And this is how I came to teach information ethics to engineers and doctoral students at the University of Paris-Saclay, mostly because I wanted our future highs. That's a caricatural, but I wanted our future highs to be able to have this dialectic reasoning part of the curriculum. First, a definition. You notice that a lot of people talk about AI ethics and I talk about information ethics. So I want to set the record straight. So I define information ethics with Luciano Floridi's definition. It is the concern for the well-being of the infosphere, or digital world, all the artifacts that are concerned. It's an ethics about this part of our world that has emerged in the past 30 years, perhaps. And when we try to organize the ethical analysis space, what we should observe first is that what matters most in ethical dilemma is not the technology that is being put to use, but it is what it is for. For instance, the same AI technique can be used in medical analysis to diagnose cancer or to analyze social network, and the ethical issues are radically different. And we should not think of the ethics of an AI technique. That doesn't make sense. We should think, we should start from the societal issue, the activity, the human activity, and that is being affected by the technology, and not start by the technology itself. AI is a tool. And so when we want to address issues in information ethics in general, we have to think about what is impacted. So we have the notion of computing systems impact that raised to the topic of cybersecurity. We have the social and economic impact. So we have to address the issues of protecting value creation, for instance, and that leads to the impact of the digital world on intellectual property. We have the dilemma of freedom of expression versus containing inappropriate speech, which raises the topic of internet ethics, which, by the way, has a lot of common points with journalism ethics, which is something that we can get inspired from. Finally, we have the human impact. And lastly, emerging, we have the notion of the effect the humanity has on its environment, and the emerging notion of sustainable computing that kind of fall within the realm of information ethics, at least leverage some interesting topics. So among the novel challenges in information ethics, I mentioned a variety of, I think, important decisions to take. We have first the notion of design ethics, how the way we present our technological artifact can generate enjoyment, but also addiction, or can be misused to capture the attention rather than to inform us better, because the frontier is very thin between nudging and informing, and between nudging and sludging, as Cass Sustained would put it. And finally, we have the realm of what I think the European Union calls AI ethics, which I think is just part of the thing. So the notion of decision governance, which we are very concerned with, notion of data science ethics, notion of autonomous system ethics. And finally, we have the notion of what I think something that the infosphere does is that it dilutes cultural boundaries. And I think this is something that must be thought about. And rather than spending a lot of time discussing things, I think just one single picture will convey everything you need to know. By the way, I want to prepare you. This picture is a little bit controversial. And so I want to say the next picture is shown for the sake of science, and not despite its vulgarity. It conveys the picture, what I'm trying to convey so well that you will apologize for the vulgarity of this picture. So what this is the same news story, relatively irrelevant news story, shown in a newspaper in Germany on the left, and in England in the right. So this is a story of parliamentary assistant that did sexy selfies. And what is very interesting is that even in communities that we would think are close in terms of cultural aspects, what is important is not what is being shown, but what is being blurred. On the left, you see that personal privacy is considered important in Germany. In English culture, it's kind of the opposite. So what is being shown has been erased by a case logo. It's more like I would say the anatomy of the person that is judged controversial. This picture tells us a lot about cultural differences, and also about how the infosphere is making these cultural boundaries merge, and making it actually impossible to satisfy the ethical dilemma, because we are gathering in the infosphere, we cannot preserve or what would be considered safe boundaries. And I think this is something that is very relevant. We in general, to ethical analysis, is that you never have a general solution. You only have specific dilemma that you have to solve one by one for a specific context and never in full generality. So in order to try to convey these things, we have organized a MOOC. You can click on the image if you have the slides to access this MOOC that we know provide to all of the doctoral students in computer science at University Paris-Saclay. And we are planning on spreading this a little bit more. And rather than sharing you the content of the course, which takes would take a long time, I would like to reflect back on what we learned by giving this course. So it's a reintrospection. So we have had so far 800 PhD students who have taken the course. And what we observe immediately is that there's a disparity in how the students appropriate themselves with the course. We have 15% of people who say, this is great, I want to do research in this aspect, and that's very good. We have 55% of people who say, yes, I learned something and it's good, I know I go back to my research, and that's very, very nice. We have 15% of people who are sometimes even outraged by what we can claim. They say, it's not my problem, I'm doing abstract mathematics, and my research has no impact on the world. I've heard that, and that's troublesome. And finally, we have also people who just have a very hard time entering the notion of dialectic reasoning. And what this tells us, the first thing that we learn from this is that not everybody takes these issues the same way, and it's very important to respect their difference. But what we have to start is with a rule-based approach. We should not start to try to teach dialectics. We should first start with what is called the conformity-based approach, where we say the rules. You should not release anything on the internet. You should ask your manager. So it's very corporate-y. But it's important that in a normal course, in a graduate university course, a student shows that they are not capable of grasping the context, the content that we're trying to convey to them. Well, they have a bad grade, and if you're teaching linear algebra, the students will not do linear algebra in their life, and that's fine. The problem with this type of teaching that we're doing is that if a student cannot show the ability or the interest in sometimes using dialectical reasoning to tackle a problem that they will encounter in their life, we cannot just give a bad grade and say it's too bad. We have to reach them, because the harm that is to be caused, if it happens, will not come from people who are concerned about this topic. It will come from people who say, I'm not interested in this. So that's why we're trying to have a very discussion-oriented course, even though it's a MOOC. It's kind of challenging to do that, and it's interesting that we are being able to use more and more tools to actually try to create this discussion on engineering ethics. As a few concluding remarks, I want to say some observation that we have as technological ethicists, some trends that we are observing. At first, I showed you that when we think about ethics in general, we think that ethical behavior is enforced through morality and law. Well, that's a common thought, but in fact, there are technological means to address ethical tensions. A very simple technical example is a key lock on a cabin in the woods. The keylock is relatively insignificant technologically, but it's a very good sign to show and to preserve the privacy and the private property. And it's not done through a panel or a law or anything. It's just the keylock. And this is something that we will see in many places in information sciences in general. You have, for instance, algorithms such as key anonymization that can be used to preserve anonymity while ensuring good AI learnability. We have homomorphic computation that can be used to preserve privacy while doing some computations. We have a lot of technological means to address the problem that that emerge from our practice. This is something that can make us hopeful that we will interest STEM students in these topics. The part that perhaps is most difficult to make emerge is the notion of truth by consensus. In ancient Greek, you have the opposition between doxa and episteme. Episteme is the Aristotelical concept of knowledge acquired through deduction or induction, which opposes doxa, which is a common opinion that can be true or false, and is not noble in a way. In ethical analysis, truth is obtained mostly by consensus, and so that is why that is the part that is kind of difficult, I think, to convey. But the good hopes is that we can see now that tech industries are hiring people with very interesting job titles. One of my good friends is hired at Google as a privacy engineer. I really like this title. And also, I told him, I know he's one of the most privacy obsessed person I ever attended. I've known him for 20 years, and I know he's a paranoiac himself. And I told him, you're my canary in the mine. If you ever quit, I will know what to do. But in so much, I know as when you're dealing with such problem inside Google, perhaps I will give a little bit more trust to Google because I know he won't take compromises. As concluding, as a set of principles that I'm trying to extract from the course, if I was to summarize it in just 3 sentences, I will take a notion, a phrase by Michael Schrage, which is a notion that you should experiment not in the wild, you should experiment on yourself first. You know of medical doctors, there are lots of examples of medical doctors who attempted operations on themselves before the operation was a success and they could show the world for a new cure or remedy. I think it should be the same with engineers when they have issues. They should ask themselves the question, I am delivering an artifact, would I want this artifact to be used on me, by me? The next thing that's important is the reciprocity in the distribution of information. If I know something about you, you must know something about me. And finally, I repeat that the very, very, very hard challenge is the notion of proof by consensus. This is shocking to say that to someone who's a physicist or a mathematician. But yes, proof by consensus exists and is needed somewhere. And lastly, I want to raise some very interesting phrase by Raphael Capurro. There is a very complex paper. It took me days to read it. But if I can summarize it, I would say this from Raphael Capurro. So according to Heidegger, our human condition is about being there. What being there means is that we are a conscious entity delimited in time and space. And what is troubling about the infosphere is that if we have the notion of computer agents, they don't have a preemption date. They are not specifically located in a computer or another. They can be duplicated or they can be migrated. And so this does not apply to a computer agent. And that makes them not human. even if they were somehow to acquire some kind of consciousness capability, they would still not be human because they are not there. And also, our traces in the infosphere are durable. They are more durable than us. And somehow they have become part of our essence. The whole sum of all the chats that I have, all the conversations that I have, all the video chats that I have are part of myself. And so what Rafael Capurro observes from this observation is that if an ethical system must be designed according to the conditions of their existence, then information technologies change those very conditions. And by way of consequence, they force us to reconsider our approach to ethical analysis. So thank you very much, everyone. And you can join with me at the chat here. I think the information is left everywhere. I would enjoy being able to talk after the question sessions if you want to join me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for this very thought-provoking and really interesting talk. So I really enjoyed it. And I'm hoping that in the remaining 13 minutes, we can have some interesting questions and answers. We already have a number of questions that came up actually on all the channels. So we have questions on Q&A, we have questions on the chat, and I think something also on the Hova web interface. So let me start with the Q&A. So I will read this out loud. And also I want to remind people that if you would like to ask the question in person live with your voice, then please raise your hand and I'll try to pass you the control. So in the meantime, let me read this question from, and you'll have to apologize if you'll have to forgive me. I apologize in advance if I don't properly pronounce the name, from Theo Tönnissen. So he's asking, regarding the information ethics and engineering discipline, I have a question about the ethics a student or professional should apply. Should it either be deontological, where the action is right or wrong, or teleological, where the purpose is right or wrong? And my opinion is, he says, and I hope to challenge it, that IT students should apply deontology because they need to excel in exercising and acting correctly, for instance, working software, and that professionals should take the purpose or effects of action into account, such as people, planet, or profit. Of course, students should learn to take the context into account as well, but they should start deontological. And actually, this is a long question, so sorry, but Theo is asking two sub-questions to this initial thought. Question one, does it make sense for students to start from deontology and then learn to take the context into account, the latest, at least as a professional? And question two, our curriculum is packed with technology and ethics is not part of it. How to teach at least these two principles, deontology and teleology? So I let you with these couple of questions.
Very interesting. It's a very interesting question. I should first start by saying that this question is assuming a deontological viewpoint. When you're formulating this question, you are a deontologist. You are not a utilitarian. First, this is because you're asking yourself, what attitude should I have? And this is the typical deontological premise. The utilitarian reason should be, I'm in this context, what is the maximal value? No, it deserves a very long answer, but I would say if you're asking yourself these questions, follow the link and the set of conferences by Michael Sandel on justice, what is the right thing to do, because even just the first session will address this much better than I can do in 5 minutes, and it's just 1 hour.
Okay, perfect. This is the kind of stuff that perhaps people can take you up on your suggestion to contact you and discuss more, since it requires a bit more debate. So I'll take the next question. So I'm trying to follow a little bit on the timeline here. So from Hugo Lopez, so he's saying workflow management systems assume that in order to take decisions, you have marked all the sources of information in your information system. Working in casework, you see that there is a lot of information that is simply not present. Caseworkers take decisions based on multiple sources, background, conditions inherent to the case. They do this on a discretionary basis sometimes. What challenge do you see in the introduction of discretion in your approach to AI-powered decisions?
This is very true. This is actually this is very true, and that is what we observed. So we took some use cases that we had in a workbench that we could reuse, and what we observed is something that in our very off-the-shelf examples, we had something like 64% confidence in the decision, in the recommendation. 64% is almost like randomness. Mm-hmm. And so we were kind of disappointed. But on the other hand, well, between 64% and 50%, it's still not, it's almost like there is no information, but there's a tiny bit of information, and perhaps we can leverage it another way. So for instance, one way would be, instead of giving our degree of confidence, we can at least point at the criteria and the attributes which we think are important in making the decision. And that did already help a little bit. Like, we think it should not be accepted because the revenue of this person is too high. Mm-hmm. That's much more interesting and much more useful than just we think you should reject the application. And so this is some of the direction where we're going toward, but it's still very true that not all the information that we need in most workflow systems, when the human is involved in the decision, it's because the relevant information is actually not in the system. Very true.
Right. Okay, thank you. So I'll go to the next question then from Samira Sherfi. Thank you for this interesting talk on a subject that is very important for us teachers and researchers. I agree with you that consensus is important. But how can we achieve this when the other side of the balance is the financial profit that is difficult to counterbalance? Technically, she's asking, how to block the British newspaper before the article appearance?
Well, you know, I did try that. I discussed this, and I was very surprised. Well, if you ask me what is shocking into this example, what is shocking is not one picture or another. It's just the idea that this is a piece of news. It's not news. The second thing is that I did conduct a survey, and I did see British students who were absolutely convinced that the Daily News was doing the right thing, and that the German Truth was doing the wrong thing. So it would be interesting if we had a poll to see in our occurrence who thinks the German are right and who thinks the British are right. If we could do that, I should have thought of doing it.
And who thinks none of them are right, and they should have not said anything about it, right?
Yes, yeah, that's my part. Yes, that's
exactly. So it's great. So questions keep arriving. We still have about 6 minutes, so I'm just keeping you informed of how we are doing with time. So we have a question from Faria Kandaker. Thank you so much for your talk. Ethics and AI is a topic I recently became interested in. Based on that new article you showed on the cultural differences, it seems like to me that laws around AI technology might become like tax laws in different countries. Some countries have more rigid tax laws than others. So some countries might have more strict laws around AI technologies than others. This leaves space for manipulation by large companies. What are your thoughts? And just before you answer this, I would like to just follow up to these, to the text, and to say, and I mean, countries are countries, but the internet is everywhere, right? So I mean, yes. How do you also deal with the fact that everybody has access to everything as well? Most people.
Yes, it's interesting to see in the COVID reaction, for instance, that Asian countries have no qualms about tracking everybody's phones. And they are very successful, and it's very socially accepted, whereas we make a huge noise about the Stop COVID application, which is really innocuous and actually very useful to be able to reopen bars and concerts. I want to go to a concert, and it's only if I have something like Stop COVID that I will be able to do so. I may have diverged and I forgot the context.
No, the fact that there would be different countries
yes.
with different laws, right? I mean, and especially AI ethics, will this become like a law that you would feel maybe in a specific country is more relaxed than in others?
Yeah, well, I think it's also very important to preserve cultural diversity as long as it's not harmful. And so, yes, the internet is merging everything. It is making local laws impossible. It's true that large corporations can abuse these diversities in laws, and they're doing it for tax. Maybe they will do it for, actually they are doing it for private information too. The Africa is completely observed, whereas we have the GDPR in Europe that is kind of helping. It's hard.
That's an open question for sure.
Yes.
We have one more question from Arne Solfberg. And I suppose it's about the role of us as information engineers. Should information engineers be expected to resolve ethical dilemmas, or to help others to discover ethical dilemmas in the information engineering phase? And if it's the latter, then how?
Okay, first, at least this is what I wanted to, that I hope has been conveyed. We are not facing ethical dilemma because we want to. We face ethical dilemma because we stumble into them. We have no choice but to address them. The next thing is, yes, once we're facing an ethical dilemma, we must not go on our work shelf, create a model, gather some data, derive a theory, and solve the problem. That's not how it works. It works by talking with colleagues first, with management, with external people, with customers, to see or to address and to build the largest consensus possible on the notion that what we did is the right thing to do.
Okay. We have one question which I have to admit I didn't quite understand on the HOVA side. It is from Sabi Zahaf, and he's saying decision process, is it part of the business process, and do you define these decision directions as dimensions? I'm not sure if you understand better than me.
I think I understand, because this is something I try to do in the course. I define 6 dimensions. I don't have the slide here, which is respect of the subjects, due diligence, precaution principle, independence. But I mean it takes also and respect of social norms. So I have a structured space that I propose to the students to do some ethical analysis, or try to organize the problem space. It's going to be very long to unfortunately, I cannot yet invite you to the course, but I encourage you, when it will be an open MOOC, which I don't know when, to take it.
Perfect. So this actually, we still have a minute, and there is no more questions. So I would just like to maybe ask a last question, since we have you here. This COVID tracing app controversy that is actually happening in France, and not only in France, applications on the smartphones for the large public to use. How do you see, what's your take on this controversy?
Okay, I did a study, and I point to that in the course, and at first I was completely outraged by the fact that it is very well known that telecom companies are using our phone data within the context of the GDPR in order to help epidemiologists. You have published papers who show that they have, for instance, tracked 12 million people in Haiti their full mobility pattern. So they claim the data is anonymous, but of course it's geolocalization, so it's not anonymous. And this is to contain cholera epidemics. There is no issue that it is allowed for emergency reasons, governments can use whatever means they can, as long as they respect of privacy. And everybody is doing that. And so when something like Stop COVID was implemented, which is far less dangerous for our lives or everything, and which is actually needed, if it's successful, of course, to avoid reconfinement. At first, I say, but why is there such a reaction? It doesn't make sense. And then I realized that what matters is not so much whether or not this application should be accepted, is that it should become a matter of public debate. And finally, I like the controversy. I don't like the controversy because I think the application is innocuous. I like the controversy because it makes people talk about it, think about it, and hopefully when they really thought it through, think, yes, this is a good thing, I'm going to adopt it.
Okay, so, thank you for this answer. It's a great way to wrap up our session, actually encouraging people to think about these topics and to discuss about them and make them part of their decisions on a daily basis. So thank you again for this great talk. Thank you all the participants for attending. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So, yeah, there's a discussion.